Charles Darwin respected him, Victor Hugo admired him, Alexander Graham Bell called him a friend, Richard Wagner welcomed him backstage, and Louis Pasteur, one of the most important scientists who ever lived, exchanged letters with him for years about vaccines and disease. That's not the resume of a typical monarch. That's the resume of Dom Pedro II, Emperor of Brazil, a man who ruled longer than almost any monarch in modern history, and who, by nearly every account we have, was actually good at it. Most royal families in history are remembered for scandal, cruelty, excess, or failure. Pedro II is remembered, even by the historians who study his downfall, as one of the most decent, intelligent, and genuinely popular rulers Latin America ever produced. He became emperor at age 5 in 1831, when his father abruptly abdicated and sailed back to Europe. For 9 years, Brazil was run by a regency government, while a child grew up inside a palace, being groomed for a job most adults would find impossible. In 1840, at just 14, he was declared old enough to rule in his own right. A year later, he was formally crowned. To put his reign in context, Dom Pedro II held the position of head of state from April 7, 1831, when he inherited the throne as a child, until November 15, 1889. That's 58 years wearing the crown in one form or another, though his actual personal rule ran for about 49 years, from his coronation onward. Either way you count it, this was one of the longest continuous reigns anywhere in the world during the 19th century. And then, for nearly 5 decades, he ruled. No civil war tore Brazil apart under his reign. No foreign power carved up his territory. He modernized the country's infrastructure, expanded education, supported the sciences, and by the time he was in his 60s, he was one of the most respected heads of state on earth, a man scientists wrote to for advice, a man European intellectuals sought out when they visited South America. By every reasonable measure, this was a stable, functioning, respected monarchy. Which is exactly what makes what happened next so strange, because on November 15, 1889, all of that ended. Not over years, not after a war, not after a scandal. It ended in less than 48 hours, with almost no fighting, no blood, and, most strangely of all, almost no resistance from the emperor himself. A man this respected, this experienced, this internationally admired, was given a single afternoon's notice to pack up his entire family and leave the country he had ruled for nearly 6 decades. And he did it, quietly, without a fight. So the real question isn't whether Pedro II was a good ruler. By most accounts, he was. The real question is this: if a monarchy this stable, this internationally respected, and this personally popular could collapse in under 2 days, what does that tell us about how fragile power actually is, even when it looks unshakable? To understand that, we have to go back to the cracks nobody was paying attention to. Cracks that had been forming for years, quietly, underneath a throne everyone assumed was safe. So if Pedro II was this popular, this respected, how does a monarchy like that fall apart in under 2 days? The answer is that the empire wasn't actually as stable as its reputation suggested. It just hadn't been tested yet. The first real fracture came from an unlikely place, the emperor's own conscience. Brazil was the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery. For decades, Pedro II had personally supported gradual emancipation, believing that ending slavery too abruptly would devastate the economy and enrage the powerful landowners who depended on enslaved labor for their coffee and sugar plantations. But by 1888, pressure, moral, political, and international, had built to the point where gradual half measures weren't enough anymore. On May 13, 1888, Brazil finally abolished slavery outright. The law was called the Lei Áurea, the Golden Law. And here's a detail that matters a lot for what happens next. Pedro II wasn't even in the country when it was signed. He was traveling in Europe for his health, and it was his daughter, Princess Isabel, acting as regent in his place, who actually signed the document that freed hundreds of thousands of enslaved people. For enslaved and formerly enslaved Brazilians, and for abolitionists around the world, this was a triumph. But for the landowning aristocracy, the class that had underwritten the empire's stability for decades, it was an act of betrayal. And crucially, they received no financial compensation for the loss of what they considered their property. That single decision, made without Pedro II's direct hand, quietly transformed Brazil's wealthiest and most politically connected class from the monarchy's strongest supporters into some of its most bitter opponents. That was crack number 1. Crack number 2 came from the military. Brazil's armed forces had grown increasingly influenced by positivism, a political philosophy popular in intellectual circles at the time that treated monarchy itself as an outdated relic, something science and progress had already made obsolete. To officers shaped by these ideas, a hereditary emperor wasn't a symbol of stability. He was a symbol of everything modern nations were supposed to leave behind. Add to this a series of tensions between military leadership and the imperial government over pay, promotions, and political influence, and you had an institution that no longer saw itself as the emperor's protector. By late 1889, some of this discontent had organized into something more concrete. A group of officers had been meeting at Rio de Janeiro's military club to discuss, in increasingly serious terms, what a change in government might look like. This wasn't a secret bunker plot in the traditional sense. It was closer to an open secret, a conversation happening in plain sight among men who no longer saw much reason to defend the system they served. And then there was crack number 3, one that's easy to overlook: succession. Pedro II's heir wasn't a son, it was his daughter, Isabel, the same Princess Isabel who had signed the Golden Law. In the deeply patriarchal political culture of 19th century Brazil, the idea of a woman ruling as empress made many elites uneasy. And Isabel's marriage made things worse in their eyes. Her husband was a French aristocrat, not a Brazilian, which fed suspicions, fair or not, that the monarchy's future would tilt toward foreign influence rather than national identity. Pedro II, for his part, seems to have sensed some of this drift, but by most accounts he was tired, worn down by decades of governing, by his health, by the slow accumulation of political fatigue that comes with sitting on a throne for half a century. He did not purge the military. He did not crack down on his critics. He kept governing, the way he always had, apparently trusting that the same stability that had carried his reign for 58 years would carry it a little further. So by late 1889, you had 3 separate groups with 3 separate grievances: landowners furious over lost property and lost compensation, military officers who saw the monarchy as obsolete, and a political establishment uneasy about who would inherit the throne next. None of these groups, on their own, was powerful enough to bring down an empire, but together, quietly, without any single dramatic confrontation, they created something far more dangerous than an angry mob. They created indifference. By 1889, when the moment came, almost nobody was willing to fight to save the monarchy, not because they hated Pedro II, but because they'd stopped believing it mattered whether he stayed. That's the part that makes this story different from most royal collapses. This wasn't a revolution driven by outrage, it was a collapse caused by exhaustion, an empire that nobody hated enough to destroy, but that almost nobody in the end cared enough to save. November 15, 1889, Petrópolis, the mountain town outside Rio de Janeiro where the imperial family kept a summer palace to escape the coastal heat. Pedro II was there, resting, when the news reached him. In Rio itself, a group of military officers, led by Marshal Deodoro da Fonseca, a respected but aging soldier who had served the empire for decades, had moved troops into position and declared, without firing a shot in anger, that the monarchy was over. A republic had been proclaimed. The coup itself moved quickly. On the morning of the 15th, troops under Deodoro's command occupied key positions around Rio de Janeiro. The prime minister of the imperial government, the Viscount of Ouro Preto, was arrested. By the end of the day, the officers behind the movement had declared Brazil a republic, with Deodoro da Fonseca positioned to become its first president. There was no declaration of war, no siege, no burning of the palace. In the span of a single day, one of the oldest continuous governments in the Western Hemisphere had changed hands. Here's what's genuinely strange about this moment, and it's the detail most documentaries skip. This wasn't a mass uprising. No crowds were storming the palace. There was no popular revolution sweeping through the streets demanding Pedro II's head. This was, structurally, closer to a boardroom decision than a revolution. A small number of powerful, organized men deciding that the monarchy's time was over, and acting on that decision with the confidence that almost nobody would stop them. Almost nobody did. When word reached Pedro II, he offered no resistance, no counter-mobilization, no appeal to loyal troops. According to accounts from those close to him, he received the news with the same composed, almost weary demeanor that had defined much of his later reign. By this point, remember, he was 63 years old, worn down by decades of rule, and, by his own private reflections, someone who had grown increasingly detached from the daily machinery of governing. This raises the question that sits at the center of this entire story. Was Pedro II's calm acceptance a sign of dignity or a sign of resignation? The historical record doesn't give us a clean answer. What we do know is that he did not attempt to fight for his throne, even though, by most contemporary accounts, he likely could have found support among segments of the population and military who still respected him personally. Word spread through Rio de Janeiro fast. The imperial government, which had functioned continuously for 58 years, stopped. Ministries that had operated under the emperor's authority the day before now answered to a provisional government headed by the very officers who had just deposed him. For the moment, the new government said nothing publicly about what would happen to the emperor and his family. Rio de Janeiro spent that night in a strange, suspended calm. A capital city that had just overthrown its head of state without a single confirmed casualty, waiting to see what would happen next. But a coup declaring a new government is one thing. Deciding what to actually do with a deposed emperor, one who still commanded genuine public affection, is another problem entirely. And that problem would be resolved within 24 hours, in a way that would end Pedro II's life in Brazil forever. The answer came the very next afternoon. On November 16, 1889, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a formal notice was delivered to Pedro II informing him that he and his entire family were to leave Brazil, not eventually, not after some transition period, but the following day. That's not a transition period. That's an eviction notice for a head of state. This was a man who had spent 58 years as head of state, who had personally corresponded with some of the greatest scientific minds of his century, who was, by most contemporary accounts, still genuinely loved by large parts of the Brazilian public. And he was being told, essentially, that he had about 24 hours to pack up his entire life and leave the only country he had ever really called home. Pedro II's response to this notice is one of the only moments in this entire story where we have his own words, recorded and preserved. In a brief public statement issued around the time of his departure, he said, in essence, that he was yielding to the circumstances forced upon him, that he would carry with him only fond memories of Brazil, and that he wished the country greatness and prosperity going forward. There was no bitterness in the recorded language, no condemnation of the men who had just ended his reign. Just a quiet, almost formal acceptance. We should be careful here. We don't have access to Pedro II's private thoughts in that moment. No diary entry, no confidential letter that tells us what he actually felt inside the walls of that palace as his staff began packing. What we have is a public statement, crafted for public consumption, and it would be speculation to claim we know what lay beneath it. What we can say for certain is what happened next, because that part is well documented. Traveling with him were his daughter Isabel, her husband, and his wife Empress Teresa Cristina, whose health had already begun to decline under the strain of those final days in Rio. On November 17, 1889, Pedro II, his family, and a small number of loyal staff departed Rio de Janeiro. They boarded a Brazilian naval vessel, the gunship Parnaíba, and were transferred at sea, near an island called Ilha Raça, to a larger ship, the warship Alagoas, for the ocean crossing to Europe. There's a version of this image worth holding on to. A head of state, who had ruled longer than almost any other monarch of his century, quietly boarding a warship belonging to the very navy that now answered to the government that had just deposed him, sailing away from the country whose entire modern development he'd personally overseen, with no guarantee he would ever set foot there again. He never would. As the ship pulled away from the coast, a small, almost quiet detail from the historical record stands out. Aboard that same vessel was the Viscount of Ouro Preto, Pedro II's own former prime minister, who sent word to the emperor that he too had been expelled from Brazil, though circumstances kept the two men from meeting face to face during the crossing. Two of the most powerful men in Brazil, just 2 days earlier, now exiled on the same ship, unable even to speak to one another. The provisional government wasn't entirely without generosity in these terms. According to accounts of the arrangement, the new authorities granted Pedro II a pension to support him in exile, though the precise figure isn't confirmed with the kind of certainty this format holds itself to, and should be treated as a detail still awaiting stronger archival confirmation. What is confirmed is that the family was allowed safe passage, and that the transition, however abrupt, wasn't accompanied by the seizure of the imperial family's physical safety or any documented violence against them. A detail that sets this collapse apart from so many other royal downfalls in history, where deposition often ended in bloodshed. What strikes historians about this entire 48-hour window isn't the speed of the collapse. Plenty of governments have fallen quickly. It's the tone of it. There was no violent purge, no show trial, no prison sentence. The new republic didn't seem interested in punishing Pedro II. It wanted him gone. And Pedro II, for reasons the historical record can describe but never fully explain, didn't seem interested in staying to find out what would happen if he refused. The emperor was gone, but his story, and the price his family would pay for this sudden, quiet exile, was only beginning. The crossing took weeks. By the time the ship reached Europe, the family wasn't heading toward Brazil's traditional diplomatic circles in France or Britain. They were heading first to Lisbon, Portugal, the ancestral home of the House of Braganza. The royal dynasty Pedro II's father had come from generations earlier. They arrived in Lisbon in early December of 1889, and almost immediately, it became clear that the stress of the previous weeks had taken a serious toll, not on Pedro II, but on his wife. Empress Teresa Cristina had been at Pedro II's side for nearly 50 years. She wasn't a prominent political figure in the way her husband was, but by most accounts, she'd been a steady, devoted presence throughout his reign, raising their children and managing the domestic side of imperial life while he governed. She was in her 60s by 1889, and the abrupt, humiliating end to the only life she'd known, combined with the physical strain of an ocean crossing into uncertain exile, appears to have broken something in her health that never recovered. The family moved north from Lisbon to the city of Porto, likely seeking a quieter place to recover. The change of scenery brought no relief. On December 28, 1889, just over a month after the coup that ended her husband's reign, and only about 3 weeks after arriving in Europe, Empress Teresa Cristina died in Porto. Sources differ slightly on the exact medical cause, with some describing heart failure and others describing a combined respiratory and cardiac collapse. What isn't disputed is the timeline. A woman who had spent nearly half a century as Empress of Brazil died in a foreign city, in exile, less than 6 weeks after being forced to leave the only country she'd called home as an adult. Pedro II, by every account available to us, was devastated. He had lost his throne, his country, and now his wife of nearly 50 years, all within the span of about 6 weeks. And unlike the loss of his throne, which came with a formal notice, a ship, a documented timeline, the loss of Teresa Cristina came with none of the institutional machinery that at least gives historians something to examine. What we're left with is the fact of it. An old man, recently deposed, now also recently widowed, standing in a foreign country with no clear picture of what his life was supposed to look like next. His daughter Isabel and her husband remained close by during this period, and it was Isabel, the same woman who had signed the law abolishing slavery and who had once been positioned as heir to the Brazilian throne, who now found herself managing a grieving, deposed father instead of a country. The political future she might once have inherited had vanished along with her father's crown. There would be no Empress Isabel. There would only be the slow, private work of helping her father survive a period of loss that had arrived faster and harder than anyone in the family could have anticipated. Financially, the family's circumstances had changed dramatically. The man who had once commanded the resources of an entire empire was now, by multiple accounts, living on considerably more modest means. A stipend from the new Brazilian government, supplemented by whatever personal funds the family had managed to bring with them. This wasn't poverty in the literal sense, but it was an enormous, disorienting contraction from the scale of resources he had commanded just weeks earlier. He did not return to Brazil for her burial. He would not return to Brazil, in fact, for the rest of his life. From Portugal, Pedro II eventually made his way onward to Paris, where he would spend what remained of his years. Whatever plans the deposed emperor might have had for his exile, a quiet retirement among relatives in Portugal perhaps, surrounded by the country of his ancestors, that plan had been shattered along with everything else. What was left was a widower, a former head of state with no state left to head, moving toward a city where, for the first time in nearly 60 years, almost nobody would recognize him on the street. By 1890, Pedro II had settled into a quiet, modest life in Paris. And this is maybe the most quietly devastating part of the entire story. A man who had spent nearly 60 years as one of the most respected heads of state in the world was now, functionally, just another elderly foreigner living in a rented residence in a European capital. Here's the detail that captures it best. On the morning of November 24, 1891, less than 2 weeks before his own death, Pedro II sat down and made a brief entry in his diary, noting that Deodoro da Fonseca, the very marshal who had led the coup against him 2 years earlier, had just resigned as president of Brazil. 2 words, according to the historical record: Deodoro has quit, a deposed emperor, in exile, quietly outliving the political fortunes of the man who deposed him, and remarking on it with nothing more than detachment. That's the whole relationship between these 2 men, reduced to a diary entry. The day before that entry, on November 23rd, Pedro II had made what would turn out to be his final public appearance, attending a meeting of the French Academy of Sciences to participate in an election. A small, telling detail, given how much of his later identity had shifted from ruling a nation to simply belonging to the world of scientific inquiry. He kept up those intellectual interests until the very end. Before the coup, Pedro II had maintained years of correspondence with Louis Pasteur, discussing developments in rabies vaccination and supporting scientific institutions back in Brazil, including an anti-rabies institute in Rio de Janeiro that Pasteur himself had praised. That correspondence continued even after Pedro II lost his throne, a strange continuity between the emperor he had been and the exile he had become. He also frequented the Louvre and stayed connected, as much as circumstances allowed, to the world of European science and culture that had respected him for decades. But respect from scientists and intellectuals is not the same thing as recognition from strangers on the street, and by most accounts, Pedro II spent his final 2 years living quietly, largely alone, without the trappings of power that had surrounded him for almost his entire adult life. This was a man who, only a couple of years earlier, had been visited and admired by some of the most famous names of the 19th century. Now he was an old man in Paris, going about a modest daily routine that had nothing to do with governing anyone. On the afternoon of November 24th, despite the cold weather, he took a long carriage ride along the Seine. He returned to his residence, the Hôtel de Bedford, and fell ill that evening. Over the following days, his condition worsened. On December 4th, he received the last rites from a local priest. That night, he continued to decline, and at 12:35 in the morning on December 5, 1891, almost exactly 2 years after boarding a warship to leave the only country he had ever really called his own, Dom Pedro II, the second and final emperor of Brazil, died in Paris. He was 66 years old. There was no state funeral in the country he had ruled for 58 years. No official day of mourning was declared by the government that had replaced him. The man who had once commanded the resources of an entire empire died in a rented residence, attended by a local priest, thousands of miles from the throne room where his reign had begun. News of his death eventually reached Brazil, where reactions were mixed. Some of the same political circles that had shown little urgency about his overthrow 2 years earlier now found themselves confronting the reality of what had actually been lost. Not just a monarch, but a symbol of 5 decades of relative national stability. Others, invested in the young republic's legitimacy, had little interest in publicly mourning the man that new government had deposed. There was no unified national response, no immediate move to bring his remains home. For the moment, Pedro II would remain buried in Europe, an emperor with no empire left to claim him. It's worth pausing on that irony, because it's the kind of detail that doesn't need embellishment to land. A man who ruled longer than almost any monarch of his century, respected by some of the greatest scientific and cultural minds in the world, died essentially unnoticed by the institutions of the country he had spent his entire life serving. What nobody in Brazil could have fully predicted, in the immediate aftermath of his death, was how differently history would eventually judge this quiet, largely unresisted collapse, and how the republic that replaced him would spend the following decades struggling to deliver on the promises that had justified removing him in the first place. Remember that diary entry, "Deodoro has quit"? That resignation matters for a reason. It's the first thread in an uncomfortable irony at the center of this entire story. The coup that ended Pedro II's reign was justified, in large part, by the idea that monarchy itself was an outdated, inefficient system, a relic standing in the way of a modern, stable Brazil. Positivist military officers and Republican reformers argued that removing the emperor would open the door to progress and stability that the old imperial system supposedly couldn't deliver. What actually happened next tells a more complicated story. Brazil's first years as a republic were marked by exactly the kind of turmoil the coup's supporters had promised to avoid. Deodoro da Fonseca's own presidency, the very collapse Pedro II had just noted from exile, days before his own death, lasted barely 2 years before resigning under political pressure. The pattern of instability that began with Deodoro's short, contested presidency would continue in various forms for decades, as the young republic struggled to establish the kind of settled institutional legitimacy that Pedro II's monarchy, for all its flaws, had managed to sustain for nearly 6 decades. This doesn't mean the monarchy should have survived, or that the abolition of slavery, the moral core of what triggered elite backlash against Pedro II in the first place, was anything other than a necessary and overdue change. But it does complicate the narrative the coup's architects offered at the time, the idea that removing an aging, respected emperor would immediately unlock a more functional, more modern Brazil. Historians studying this period point to something else entirely. What the coup actually demonstrated wasn't that monarchy was uniquely fragile. It was that legitimacy, the quiet, often invisible agreement among a country's institutions that a government deserves to hold power, can evaporate even when a leader remains personally popular if the coalition of elites underwriting that legitimacy decides their own interests are no longer being served. In the years and decades that followed, as Brazil's republican governments proved turbulent and, at times, authoritarian, a curious thing happened. Historical memory of Pedro II began to shift. The man who had been dismissed as an outdated relic in 1889 began to be reassessed, gradually, as one of the more competent and stable heads of state in Brazilian history, not despite the comparison to what came after him, but specifically because of it. A government toppled for being outdated was replaced by one that spent its early decades struggling to prove it was any more stable than the throne it had removed. That reassessment wouldn't be complete for decades, but it would eventually lead Brazil to do something it had refused to do in the immediate aftermath of the coup: bring its last emperor home. For over 30 years, Dom Pedro II remained buried in Europe, first laid to rest in Lisbon, alongside the remains of the wife he had lost within weeks of his exile beginning. It wasn't until 1921 that Brazil took its first real step toward bringing him home. That year, coinciding with the centennial of Brazil's independence from Portugal, the remains of Pedro II and Empress Teresa Cristina were transferred from Europe back to Brazilian soil for the first time since his death, 3 decades earlier. A symbolic gesture from a nation that was finally ready to reckon with what it had done to the man who had ruled it for nearly 60 years. The process of fully honoring his legacy took even longer. It would be years after that initial transfer before Pedro II's remains were formally reinterred at what is now the Imperial Mausoleum inside the Cathedral of São Pedro de Alcântara in Petrópolis, the very town where he'd been resting the day the coup was declared against him. Historical sources vary on the exact date of that final reinterment, and this format won't manufacture false precision where the record itself isn't settled. What's clear is the broader arc. A monarch dismissed as obsolete in 1889 was, within a few decades, being welcomed home with the kind of national honor his own government had denied him at the moment of his death. There's a strange symmetry worth noting here. Petrópolis was where the coup first reached him, the mountain retreat where he learned, on a quiet afternoon, that his reign was over. Decades later, it became the place where Brazil finally chose to honor him permanently, laying him to rest in the same town where his fall began. His daughter Isabel, the woman who had signed the law ending slavery and who might once have become Brazil's first empress, spent the rest of her own life in European exile as well, never returning to rule the country her father had lost. The line of succession she represented never took power again. Brazil would remain a republic from that point forward, its imperial chapter permanently closed even as its founding emperor was, eventually, welcomed back in death. Today, historians and Brazilians alike largely regard Pedro II's reign very differently than the men who overthrew him did in 1889. He's frequently ranked among the most capable and consequential heads of state in Brazilian history, not as a perfect ruler and not without real, documented flaws, including his hesitance on abolition and his role in a political system that concentrated enormous power in a single hereditary figure. But measured against the instability that followed his removal, his nearly 6-decade reign is now widely viewed as a period of unusual national stability. So what do we actually take from this story? Not that monarchy is inherently better than a republic. History offers plenty of examples in both directions. What Pedro II's fall actually demonstrates is something quieter and, in some ways, more unsettling, that institutions don't always collapse because they're hated. Sometimes they collapse because the coalition holding them up stops believing they're worth defending, and by the time anyone notices, the emperor is already on a ship, and the empire is already gone. Pedro II never fought for his throne. He never fought to return to Brazil. And in the end, it wasn't a war or a revolution that brought him home. It was history itself, slowly, decades later, deciding it had misjudged him. That's the story of an emperor nobody hated enough to fight for, and history eventually forgave. If it stuck with you, tap like and subscribe. More stories like this one every week.